Salve, Greece and Rome students. Thank you guys for checking in today. And this is our last kind of normal week of school. And we're starting our very last chapter of the year today. So thanks for coming in. And this chapter is not too long. I'm going to kind of condense it, and we are going to be able to finish it probably just today and tomorrow and wrap up the entire book. It's going to be the last 100 or so years of the Roman Empire in the West, at least. The East goes on a lot after that, but there's no time to get that in. So we'll see the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It's not the most glorious time in Roman history because they're basically falling apart in the West, but we do need to cover it to kind of know what happens, okay? So we will do that today and tomorrow, and then I think we'll take our tests, our final test of the year, chapters 13 and 14, on Friday, just kind of set out the schedule for you. Now, last chapter, the last emperor we talked about was Theodosius I. He was pretty widely regarded as being a good emperor. He came in when Rome was in a period of crisis. If you remember, they had lost the Battle of Adrianople, which was a huge loss to the Goths, and things were just kind of like chaotic. What's going to happen after this? And he managed to strike a pretty good treaty with the Goths. It wasn't perfect because, of course, it left the Goths kind of intact in a semi-autonomous group, but it did at least alleviate the threat for that time. So today we're going to see what came after Theodosius I. And let me get myself out of here. So when he died, Theodosius was regarded by most people as kind of the savior of Rome. He was kind of that last really great emperor looking back on. We're not going to have any more quite like him. And he died in 395. He had two sons, and he left his position basically to them. When he died, his son Arcadius was 18 and Honorius was 11. So both pretty young. Obviously, Honorius very young, so they're going to need some help, ruling their various parts of the empire. Neither of them really managed to live up to their father's mold or their father's expectation. Neither grew into really a strong leader, and both of them were manipulated and controlled by officials, especially Honorius. So Honorius took over the West for his father, and he was controlled by a regent called Stilicho, because again, he's 11. He's not quite ready to rule things. So he was controlled by Stilicho, who was a high-ranking but dedicated Vandal cavalry officer. Again, you had all sorts of tribes who had, it was a thing where they would enter the Roman military and serve with the Roman military. So Stilicho had done that for years, and he was basically kind of controlling things in the background for Honorius, who again was just 11 when he became emperor. In the eastern side, you had Arcadius, the older son. He was also a bit young, so he was controlled early on by the Praetorian prefect under him called Rufinus. Eventually, Rufinus got into a dispute with Stilicho, and Stilicho sent orders for him to be killed, and that eventually was carried out. After that, Arcadius was overseen by a eunuch called Eutropius, and Eutropius eventually gets removed by the people of Constantinople. So not a lot of good fates for the people who are watching over Arcadius. Now, what about these group of Goths who, this group of thousands of Goths who were left intact? This is kind of Theodosius's legacy. It went okay sometimes. The Goths did fight for Rome. That was actually part of the agreement, is that you can keep this land, you're going to fight for Rome. So they did fight for Rome sometimes, but again, they're not 100% loyal. They still feel more like Goths than they do Romans. They're not completely bought in like people used to. So even though they fought for Rome and helped sometimes, they remained a constant threat. There was occasional revolt and fights between them and the Romans, and eventually by the year 400, they occupied the city of Constantinople, basically demanding more rights, demanding to be taken more seriously. The people of Constantinople resented this barbarian presence, resented these Goths coming in and trying to take over their city. They eventually kind of ganged up and got together and expelled them from the city. They burnt a large group of Goths together and burnt them alive in a church. So it tells you how kind of intense and bitter this battle was getting. So from that point on, it had gotten to be a problem with the Romans using tons of barbarians in their military. Just there might be a lot of reasons for that. They just didn't have enough people, could be a reason. You could say some of the Romans themselves had gotten soft and there weren't enough of them to take on these wars. But for whatever reason, they'd be using so many barbarians. After that, though, the eastern side especially got more weary of using barbarians to fill out their military ranks, and especially not the military ranks. Sometimes they did have barbarian soldiers, but for allowing barbarian generals to rise up to a high level, the East was more careful with that after that. So things are pretty crazy in the east in Constantinople at that time. So after this whole ordeal, the Goths turn west, thinking the west is probably a little more ripe for the picking. The rest is kind of chaotic, very chaotic at this time. So they turn west and they invade Italy in 401 and 402 under a pretty dynamic leader called Alaric. And so they're invading Italy a few times. They're driven back by Stilicho, who again was trying his best and he was working hard. But each time, even though Rome won, they suffered heavy losses. And, it was one of those Pyrrhic victories where the losses were heavy, even in victory. So it was at this time that Honorius, who we know was a younger emperor, he withdrew the court from Milan to Ravenna. Now let me explain that. I don't know if the book even mentioned this, but Diocletian was an emperor who, in the western part of the empire, he moved the capital of Rome to Milan. You could see on the map here, of course, we know where Rome is. Milan is to the north. There was a number of reasons for Diocletian doing this. Diocletian was a little more focused on the east, so he wasn't always in the west. But also, you have all these threats up in the north. It might have made sense for the emperor to be a little bit closer and able to respond to those threats. But since the late third century, the emperor had of the West, at least, had lived and had his court and lived in Milan. So, kind of weird to think, well, Rome, the capital, is no longer Rome, but that had been the case for a while. So at this time, in the early 5th century, Honorius moves the capital to Ravenna. And the reason for this was Ravenna was very, very easily well protected, and it was surrounded by a swamp that was very hard to move an army through. So it was protected, but of course it looked weak. It was a look of weakness, and it isolated him. It made him seem like he was running from things. And it basically told these northern tribes that, hey, the Roman emperor can't really protect his city, and that's why he's withdrawing to Ravenna. So, there's some good to the move, but definitely some bad. So at this point, various Gallic and German tribes were able to move south with more impunity and move into Italy. By 406, Honorius had lost control of Britain. So Britain had been under Roman control now for over 300 years, and so they're basically losing control, and tribes there are taking over territory, and the Romans are having to retreat. And then a very disastrously bad miscalculation. Honorius gets reports, or who knows, he had grown up a little bit, and people start whispering in his ear that Stilicho was disloyal. Even though, we never know for sure, but Stilicho was the one who was basically trying to defend the West and keeping things at least somewhat pulled together, even though things were going badly. But someone whispered to him that Stilicho was being disloyal or was a traitor or something, and so Honorius executes Stilicho, who was, again, the one trying to defend the Western Roman Empire. So this was a pretty disastrous move because at this point, 30,000 of those troops who had been fighting for the Romans, they were with Stilicho. They were there because of him. He was their leader. And so they abandoned Rome and actually joined the Goths, joined up with Alaric. So at the same time, Honorius loses his best general. He loses 30,000 men, and the enemy gained 30,000 men. So this, nothing's going right for the Western Roman Empire at this point. This certainly was not a good thing that happened. So needless to say, things are going to get worse after 406. So at this point, Alaric, he grows bolder because he now has more soldiers, and Honorius is clearly weakened and hiding out. He besieges the city of Rome in 408, and Honorius gets him to back off by paying a massive ransom, basically saying, hey, I can't fight you, but here's a huge bundle of riches and treasure and stuff to back off. So Alaric backs off temporarily, but eventually the Goths again besiege Rome. Usually when you pay people off, it's only temporary. Again, the Goths besiege Rome, this time successfully in 410, and they loot the city basically for 3 days. Even though the damage was limited, they didn't just burn the city to the ground. Most citizens were spared. It wasn't a bloodbath, but the symbolic impact was devastating. This was the first time that Rome, the city itself, had been sacked in like 700 years, right? And it just went to show that the emperor was losing such control in the west of his empire. Yeah, he's losing Britain, but that's far away. Now he can't even keep the enemy and the barbarians out of Rome itself. So even though it wasn't technically the capital anymore, just the fact that he can't defend Rome, why are people going to stay loyal to him if he can't even defend Italy, right? So it's just a terrible, terrible look for the Western Roman Empire. And the painting you see here is of the Gallic barbarians kind of tearing down some Roman statues and and whatnot. So 410 is a very famous sacking of Rome. Hadn't happened in a long time. After Rome, the gods decided to head south and basically to see what else they can plunder and loot and attack. So they try to sell to Africa to continue this plunder and pillaging. Africa is a pretty wealthy area at this time. But a storm, they have some bad luck. A big storm comes, wrecks most of their ships, and Alaric dies in this massive storm. So a little breather for not long, but a little breather for the Romans and for the North Africans when the Goths are taken out by Mother Nature, basically. So Alaric is dead, and his people give him a burial there. And the gods now are led by a leader called Athalf, and they head north because their ships are mostly destroyed. They head north out of Italy to basically regroup. Um, so Rome in a bad position at this point because basically they were undefended for the most part. So Britain was officially abandoned by the Romans in 410. Basically, the emperor sent a message to the remaining Romans and governor there saying, "I can no longer support you." So this is when Britain basically stopped being under Roman control, and it was allowed to kind of fall into anarchy for a while, and for various native tribes and stuff to take it back over. Of course, this wasn't the end of it. Rome's grip on Gaul and Spain was weakened during the early 5th century. Various tribes took control. So basically, if you saw a map of the Western Roman Empire at this time, then you would see the territory that Rome controlled kind of shrinking during the early 5th century because they're just losing here and there, and it's hard to stop the bleeding. So during this time, you have different tribes taking over bits of Roman territory: the Vandals, the Suebi, of course, the Goths, the Franks, Burgundians, and some more tribes we could mention, but that's just some of them. To mention the Vandals, they were kind of a big, powerful, threatening tribe at this time. The Vandals had a good leader called Genseric, and disastrously for the Romans, Genseric took North Africa around the year 439 AD. This was such a big deal because you might remember that North Africa was important for the grain supply. Tons of grain to feed the city of Rome and some parts of Italy were sent back from Africa, which had a lot of fertile land. So this is where you get the term Vandal nowadays from, or vandalism, because basically the Vandals were so effective at destroying and seizing things and plundering things. They continued to plunder the Western Mediterranean, and eventually they set their sights on Rome, and they come in and sack Rome in 455. So Rome was sacked by the Goths in 410, by the Vandals in 455, and again, terrible, terrible time to live in Rome if that were you. People are going to be moving out of Rome at this time, as you can imagine. Number one, the city's getting attacked here and there, which is bad. But also, now that Africa has been taken out of Roman control, there's just not enough grain to go around to feed all those people. Remember, Rome at one time, they think, was over 1 million people. You just need food and water to feed those people. So now that Rome no longer controlled North Africa, there was not enough grain or water to go around. So people were basically fleeing Rome to move to other places, to move to the countryside. And we think that by the early 6th century or so, we have estimates that the population was around 50,000. So 5% of the people that it used to be now living in Rome is a pretty crazy outcome. The water supply also would have been affected because during the 5th century you have certain of these barbaric tribes destroying aqueducts, and they did that specifically because they know that would affect the people in Rome and weaken the city itself. So simultaneously there's trouble with the food supply and trouble with the water supply. So terrible time to live in Rome. So things are basically crumbling at this point, right? Obviously, this takes a number of decades to happen. Looking back, it seems like the blink of an eye, but this takes decades to happen. But looking back, it looks almost inevitable because we just don't have any strong leadership from the side of the Romans, right? But next time we will come back and kind of see what happens through the last little bit of the empire here. We're going to go through 476 is the traditional date. We'll talk about that. Also, we'll just have a little update on how things are going in the East, because again, the Eastern Empire at this time it's still going okay. They have some better leaders. It's still going strong. And the Eastern Empire will, it's kind of crazy, run for another 1,000 years after the West falls, almost 1,000 years. So we'll talk about what's going on in the East after. And tomorrow we should be able to finish up the notes completely for this chapter. Okay. So I'm excited to do this last week with you guys. Thank you guys for getting your notes down today. And tomorrow, I know you're going to be upset about this, should be our last day of notes for ancient Greece and Rome. So I'm sorry to disappoint you. I know you love my notes. But have a great day, guys, and I'll be back tomorrow, and we will finish up the fall of Rome. Walete.